"Would you still love me if I was a worm?" might be a silly TikTok trend, but it's exactly the question Franz Kafka explored over a century earlier. In the Metamorphosis, he transforms his protagonist into a giant insect and lets us watch the dynamics that play out. How the people closest to him treat him, how fragile our most well-meaning feelings prove to be under strain, and how systems dehumanize individuals long before anything so dramatic happens. In this video, I want to explore this fantastic story that is equal parts heartbreaking and disgusting, and which challenges our strongly held notions about meaning, suffering, and unconditional love. Do note that this is my own interpretation, and I strongly encourage you to read it for yourself and draw your own insights. Kafka wastes no time on world building and introductions and serves as directly the main event. One morning, when Gregor Samsa awoke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. We are then immediately introduced to our protagonist, Gregor, by his occupation, a traveling salesman in the textile industry who lives with his parents and his sister, Greta. After absorbing the initial shock of the body he finds himself in, Gregor immediately starts thinking about how he's going to miss his 5 a.m. train if he doesn't get out of bed right now. Note that in Gregor's head, the only thing standing between him and going about his day is getting out of bed. The insect body situation doesn't seem to trouble him as much. As he's lying on his back and flailing his many tiny legs around in an attempt to flip over and leave the bed, he reflects on the job he very much hates and how eager he is to leave it in a few years, once he has helped his parents pay off their debt. But if he stayed in bed any longer, the company was sure to send someone to demand a very good explanation for why he missed his 5 a.m. train. He thought about calling in sick, but remembered the company's doctor who didn't believe that sick employees existed, only work-shy ones. And Gregor clearly convinced himself of that narrative, because in his 5 years of employment, he wasn't sick even once. Here, Kafka's obsession with impersonal systems like bureaucracy and employment and how they dehumanize and discard the individual shines through. Kafka was trained as a lawyer, and throughout his short life, he held various jobs, which he professed he deeply hated. He declared that his one and only passion was writing, and he resented the obligation to hold a job, which kept him from dedicating his time to his literary interests. In many of his works, he portrayed scenarios where individuals are trapped in illogical systems they often cannot understand or escape. No one even needs to be outwardly cruel to them for harm to happen. The harm naturally follows from the silent power that operates through rules, defined roles, and systematic processes. Everyone is just doing their job, and the consequences are normalized. The psychological impact on the individuals living under such systems is what interested Kafka the most. Constantly having to justify your existence and needs, being eaten up by persistent, low-level guilt, and being under the mercy of timelines you have no control over. More than anything, he was consumed by how modern life reshapes identity and changes the way people see themselves. People begin to define themselves by their functions and ability to provide utility, even in their own personal relationships, which often leads them to anticipate blame and live with a debilitating sense of anxiety. We see this everywhere in our modern life. Corporate life, healthcare systems, immigration offices, academia, you name it. I suppose this is why many people opt for entrepreneurship and the freedom it promises. Although the irony is that they end up creating exactly the same systems they escaped. The logic of systems is so deeply internalized that it's almost impossible to imagine a different way of operating. We see this with Gregor. He has completely internalized that logic and fused his identity with the role of being the family's provider. So much so that when he's transformed into a giant insect, the only thing occupying his mind is not missing work, no matter the cost. Even long before he turned into an insect, he was dehumanized and reduced to his functional utility. The current situation merely made it unavoidable to see. And surely enough, less than 2 hours later, someone from his company showed up to demand an explanation for his absence. Soon, his parents, sister, and the company clerk were at his door, banging and sounding entirely offended by his negligence. Gregor finally managed to get himself out of bed while apologizing enthusiastically and assuring everyone that this is nothing but a temporary inconvenience and that he will certainly get better in no time and return to his top-notch performance. He thought that surely once he gets to the door and they see him, they will all understand and it will all make sense. But all they could hear was horrible screeches, and seeing him, needless to say, only resulted in a tragedy of misunderstandings. What Kafka exposes here is a brutal asymmetry. Gregor believes being seen will earn him understanding, that the rules he's expected to go by will bend in accordance with the unusual situation he's in. But what ends up happening is that being seen dehumanizes him even more. The company clerk flees for his life, and Gregor is chased back to his room where he's locked away amid screams and horror from his family. From this point on, the family's problem is no longer Gregor's inability to work, but Gregor himself. His sister is empathetic towards him initially and brings him an assortment of foods to figure out what he likes, which turns out to be rotten fruits. His parents, on the other hand, refuse to see him entirely and are torn away by grief. Gregor, again, internalizes his new role, being as invisible as possible, hiding under the sofa in the room, not to inconvenience anyone by the sight of him. I believe Kafka here is trying to demonstrate a point we all know on some level, but refuse to admit. We tend to want to believe that love can be unconditional, and it can very well disguise itself as such, when it doesn't collide with fundamental parts of our life and selfhood too loudly. In partnerships, for example, we tend to choose partners whose lifestyle or personality go along smoothly with ours. Occasional frictions can be tolerated as long as they don't become sustained over long periods of time, as long as they don't threaten our identity and impose on our time and routines too much. In that sense, love can appear unconditional until its maintenance fee surpasses our feelings. And when that happens, it isn't a shift overnight that leads to the withdrawal of that love. They are small changes that happen gradually over time. Fatigue, impatience, tolerance, a sense of duty towards the person. And Kafka shows us that process happening in the story. Gregor's family no doubt loved him very much. But following his transformation, their love was contingent on him reverting back to his former self. Everyone was tolerating him on the hope that his condition improves. This doesn't mean that people are bad for being incapable of loving unconditionally, but we tend to associate unconditional love with virtue so deeply when realistically, love always comes with unwritten conditions that only surface when it becomes impossible to maintain them. As a result, we subconsciously reorganize our social roles to continue to receive that love, to meet those conditions. We see this in the story when slowly with time, the quality of care and attention Gregor receives through his sister drops significantly. But specifically after one particular incident, things deteriorated quickly. His sister notices his newly found interest in crawling over the walls and decides that it's in his best interest to empty his room of furniture to give him space. Gregor was in two minds about it. On the one hand, it would be nice to have the space. On the other hand, it would deprive him entirely of any memory of his human past. He watches her and his mother take away the furniture piece by piece. It was, after all, mostly heirloom he didn't particularly care about. Until it was time to take away one particular picture on the wall. It was a picture of a woman in fur, the one piece that he himself picked out and represented a part of himself and his own tastes. He decided that they cannot take it away. He will guard it even if he had to jump on his sister's face. Not surprisingly, when his mother saw the giant brown insect on the wall, she fainted. His sister rushes out of the room to grab some medicine, and Gregor, without thinking, rushes after her, thinking that surely she needs his advice and help, just like the old times. He so desperately wanted to feel indispensable to someone again. From that point, the situation escalates quickly when his father sees him and starts throwing apples at him. One apple hits and injures him and becomes stuck in his back. Despite knowing of his injury, nobody tries to take the apple out, and he's left to suffer in his room for the coming weeks. Over the weeks that follow, he becomes even more neglected. His sister now passes him food hurriedly without trying to accommodate his tastes or check whether he has eaten or clean the room properly. Dust and dirt accumulate, and his room becomes a storage place for any items the family wants stowed away. They indeed had their best intentions to care for him the best they could. But over time, with the maintenance cost increasing and imposing on their comfort, that love started to wear thin. Slowly but surely, Gregor becomes more of a burden, and his condition worsened until he wasn't able to eat anymore. His family's patience wears out, and to make the inevitable easier on themselves, they convince themselves that the insect cannot be Gregor, and that they must get rid of it. Believing that it's Gregor would still oblige them to him, and they are no longer able to carry that obligation. When Gregor overhears them, he agrees, and he lays there, unable to move from starvation and infection. He thinks back on his family with love and draws his last breath. But note that Gregor's love for his family wasn't selfless either. It gave him a stable sense of identity. He was the family's provider. He was needed and depended upon. Every day he woke up knowing exactly what he should do, and he didn't have to face the existential dread of finding a purpose on his own. In turn, this earned him the continued love of his family. Providing for them is how he proved that he deserved a place. I suppose we all do this on some level, even if unconsciously. We constantly reorganize our roles and contributions to ensure that we hold enough importance in other people's lives to receive their love and support. Again, this isn't cruel or manipulative in any way, except of course in instances where it intentionally is. It's simply how human relationships tend to function once you strip away the myths of pure selflessness and unconditional love. But perhaps one of the most disturbing parts of the story is what happens after Gregor's death. You would expect the family to be heartbroken over his loss, despite the burden he has increasingly become. But the news of his death was met with relief. So much relief, in fact, that the family decided to take the day off and go on a little outing. And while they are out, Gregor isn't mentioned even once. Their conversation is focused entirely on their grand plans for the future. I remember when I first read this story, the ending really made me sad and left a sense of something feeling unfinished. We are so used to suffering and sacrifice carrying a meaning or being redeemed in some way or another. That's the only way we can make sense of terrible things and justify suffering. But Kafka denies us that relief. Gregor's suffering doesn't transform anyone. It doesn't deepen love or produce understanding. It simply ends, and life continues. Because as much as we would like for it all to mean something, suffering doesn't automatically generate meaning. It's what we and the systems we inhabit and propagate insist on inventing to make life a little less unbearable. If you are still hungry for more depressing philosophical takes on how meaningless life is, you might enjoy this next video.